Hello class, welcome back. Today we're going to be reviewing a bit of what you did in your homework, and then we're going to start our first real lesson in counterpoint. So it's an exciting day, it's a big day. Before we get there though, we need to make sure that the basics are covered. Some of us maybe took some time between theory classes, so maybe it's a bit rusty. Also over summer we tend to forget some things. That's okay. So let's just be reminded. I'd say the two most important things that you need to know before we go on have to do with intervals and inversions. These things come up all the time in theory. They come up all the time in music when you're learning a piece of music. Being able to sight read something, knowing your intervals is extremely helpful. Same goes with inversions. If I were to sit down at a piano and I see shapes on the page, well, I know instantly, oh yeah, that's a first inversion, that's a second inversion. Am I naming them in my head? Well, maybe not, but I kind of know them intuitively because I've just spent so much time with inversions. And this helps me to know what I'm playing much more quickly. Okay, so let's review these quickly. You may or may not have used what's called the scale method in terms of learning your intervals. What is the scale method, you're asking? Well, you know your C major scale or versus the C natural minor scale. Now, if you were to picture that you are measuring the distance from the bottom note to the next note. So from scale degree 1 to scale degree 1, let's say if we had a second scale degree like this, okay, this would be called a perfect unison. So let's say I sang C and you sang the exact same C, right? That would be a unison. Choirs do it all the time. Let's say the sopranos sing together the same note, that's a unison. Okay, let me give myself a little more space. Okay, let's say here's your second scale degree, and again, I'm measuring it from the bottom note, C. Okay, and what do I come up with? Well, that, of course, is a major second. Okay, I'm going to continue doing this. Okay, and what do I get? I get major third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, major sixth, major seventh, perfect octave. If you don't know this already, this is extremely useful because look, everything is either major. All right, here we have the major second, third, sixth, and seventh. Those are our imperfect intervals. And then we have the others, perfect unison, fourth, fifth, octave. Those are our perfect intervals. So how is this useful when you're figuring out intervals? Well, let's say I gave you two notes. And you're thinking, oh, well, that's C and F. I'm going to pretend as if this is in the key of C major. And oh, I know from the first scale degree to the fourth scale degree, that would be over here. That's a perfect fourth. What if I gave you this? I gave you F sharp. Now you can still use the scale method because you're comparing it to what you know. You know that C and F is a perfect fourth. This is C and F sharp. So you know it's 1/2 step bigger. All right, you know it's some kind of fourth, this distance. It has to be a fourth because we've counted and we're comparing it to the scale. What's 1/2 step bigger than a perfect interval? And that's right, if you've remembered from your previous training, that's an augmented sixth. I'm sorry, why did I say sixth? Augmented fourth. Okay, so and a good way to remember, so perfect intervals. Okay, so let's say put P in the middle here. If you go 1/2 step bigger, that's going to be augmented, and 1/2 step lower, that's going to be diminished. So, okay, so let me go back to C to F. We know that that's a perfect interval. Okay, what about, I have a good one. C sharp to F. Now I know what you're thinking. Oh, we made it bigger, but actually, did we? If I bring this bottom note up and this top note stays the same, aren't we actually making the interval smaller? Try it out on the piano and see if you see what I'm talking about. C to F is a perfect fourth. Okay, so let's identify that. C sharp to F. Well, it also has to be some kind of fourth. We know that. But what is it? Well, it's one half step smaller than a perfect fourth. What's one half step smaller than a perfect fourth? Well, that's a diminished fourth. This interval doesn't come up too often, but it does exist, and you should know how to figure it out. Again, you can start by comparing it to the major scale. That's an easy way to start. Okay. Now you can do the same thing with the minor scale. All right. So let's go through the same process. So I'm going to say C to C. C to C is of course unison. It starts out similarly. Let's see, D to C. Well, here, let's do this first. Okay, we're going to have, again, this is major second. This would be a minor third, perfect fourth, perfect fifth, minor sixth, minor seventh, perfect octave. So almost all of the imperfect intervals, seconds, thirds, fourth, sixths, and sevenths, seconds, thirds, sixths, and sevenths, almost all of those are minor except for that second. So that might not help you so much. So let's say you saw C and D flat. Well, you could still compare it to the scale. You know that C to D is a major second. So what's one half step smaller? That's right, you're going to get the minor second. Okay, and here for imperfect intervals, if you're going to make an alteration to imperfect intervals, let's say you have major here, one half step smaller than major, of course, would be minor. One half step smaller than minor would be diminished. What about the other direction? What if you had a major interval and then you made it bigger by a half step? That would be augmented. So these two, treat them like, I'm hesitating to say cheat sheet. It's not cheating, but these are good notes to take. If you haven't learned this yet, do write this down. For perfect intervals, the order would be diminished, perfect, and augmented. For imperfect intervals, diminished, minor, major, augmented. And again, how is this helpful comparing it to the scale? Well, it's only helpful if you really know your scales. Some people have trouble with scales also. So maybe this method doesn't work for you. Maybe you need to count your half steps. But you do need to figure out a way to know your intervals better. Most of us are in that category. When we first start out there's just so many intervals and it's tough to figure them out. But I assure you, the more time you spend with them, of course, just like anything, that will become more second nature. Okay, so wait, what if I have an interval that's not starting with C? Let's say I start with F and I go to B. Okay, now I'm asking you, okay, well, what's the distance between these notes? Well, the first thing you should do is count the notes. Now, one big mistake that I see a lot of beginners make is that they forget to count one. You need to count one for the first note and picture the scale. If you compare this to the scale, this makes a lot of sense. You could think of it as scale degree 1 if you were comparing this to, let's say, F major. So you're going to count 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, you get 4 on your way up to that B. So between F and B, that's 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so the distance would be, here, I'll make these small because we're not counting them. Oops. Let's do this. Okay. So we're not comparing these, we're counting the distance between F and B. Okay, so here, let me write this over here so you're not confused. This is perfect. Or is it perfect? That's a good question. So we need to think about, okay, It's some kind of fourth, but we don't know. Is it perfect? Is it augmented? Is it diminished? Let's try to figure this out. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to take this scale and I'm going to move it up to F major. Now, F major, you might remember your keys, has a flat in it. Do you remember which one? That's right, it has the B flat. Okay, so now this looks like F major. Okay, now remember, we're trying to figure out the distance between F and B. We look over here, F to B is a perfect fourth in our scale. F to B flat is a perfect fourth. But we're looking for F to B natural. So how do we do this? This makes it slightly bigger. If you go to the piano, compare between F to B flat versus F to B natural, you'll see that we're making the interval bigger. All right, you've memorized the order of perfect intervals: diminished, perfect, augmented. Okay, so we're making this bigger, aren't we? This is an augmented fourth. Okay, so you can see the scale method is not the only way to remember intervals, but it's a useful way if you know your scales. So if you feel like, okay, I know all of my major scales, I know all of my minor scales, this is really going to be helpful figuring out intervals. Okay, if you don't know those, well, first of all, you should be learning all of your major and minor scales, but that's a long process. The other way to do it is to count half steps. So you can have a little chart next to you. You can count in half steps and or whole steps. But this requires you to memorize a lot more information. This is why I would recommend using the scale method. Okay, so please, if you're one of those who feels like you're a bit rusty, or maybe you just never learned intervals well enough, you need to spend some time with them now so that you succeed in this course, because we talk a lot about intervals in here. Okay, and the other big thing that I need you to remember are inversions. So let's do a quick review of inversions. Now, what are we inverting when we invert something? Well, first let's take a look at a triad. So let's say we're talking about in the key of C major. Let's say we have a 1 chord, right? Okay, and I'll make these nice and big, and so I'm going to label my key C major. And how would you label that function? Well, the function of that is the tonic, and we represent that with the Roman numeral 1. Okay, this is in root position, so I'm not going to write anything next to it. It's just Roman numeral 1. That's it. That's how we represent it. Sometimes books will say 5-3 next to it, but that's just saying above this bass note you have the 3rd and the 5th. Okay, so that's being very thorough. Okay, what if we take this bottom note and we move it up an octave? So I'm going to copy and paste this over here. I'm going to take this note and transpose it. I'm going to go up here. Ah, there we go. Now it's up an octave. Can you see that move from C to C? There we go. Okay, now this is still a 1 chord. It's all the same notes. It's not a 3 chord just because it starts on the 3rd scale degree. It's still a 1 chord, but we need to label it differently because the bottom note is E. We need to call it what it is, right? When you see a friend on the street, you call them by their name. All right, maybe he or she's the sibling to someone else who looks very similar, but maybe they share the same DNA, but they're different. Okay, so we need to label them, give them the right name. Okay, this is what's called the first inversion triad. Okay, so that's going to be represented by 1, 6. Again, this was root position. All right, this is first inversion. Let me give a little room here. Okay, and then we're going to do this one more time because there's one more note in a triad. I'm going to copy and paste this over here. I'm going to take this bottom note and move it up an octave. So E goes to E up here. Ah, there we go. So can you see from E to E? Now again, this is still a 1 chord. So I'm going to label it as a 1, but it's not a 1 and it's not a 1/6. We have to call it something else. Shares the same DNA, but it's different because of that G in the bass. Okay, so we're going to call it a 1/6/4. Now, what are these numbers doing? Well, at first, you should just memorize it. Just know root position, first inversion, second inversion. Here's what we call them: 1, 1/6, 1/6/4. Okay, let me put this here, second inversion. Okay, but is there a reason for having these labels? Yes, absolutely. What we're doing is measuring the distance between the bottom note and the notes above it. So the distance between E and G is a third. The distance between E and C is a sixth. So this is a shorthand way of saying, okay, so there's that sixth. Okay, that labels it as first inversion. Okay, some books will be super thorough and they'll say 6/3. I think this is just confusing because it's an extra thing you have to remember. But some textbooks will go through that and label, give it the full distinction. So you could say this is a 1/5/3 chord. You could say this is 1/6/3. Why is this 6/4? Same idea, where you're measuring the bottom note to the upper note. So G to C is a fourth, G to E is a sixth, and there you have it. That's the 1/6/4. Okay, if we kept going, well, guess what? You would come back around again. If you copied and pasted this, took that bottom note, move it up an octave, G to G, look what you get. You're back to root position. So it comes back full circle. You only have 3 options: root position, first inversion, second inversion, because you have 3 notes in the triad. Okay. If you don't know this already, or you're feeling rusty, or maybe you learned it a different way, I need you just to memorize it, because this course will refer to root position, first inversion, second inversion. I need you to know those very quickly. All right, so you might write this out for yourself, these 3 chords. Okay, now there's one more thing I want you to know before we start our first real lesson of this course, and that's inversions of the 7th chord. This is going through the same process. Here, I'll keep it in this key of C, but I would say the most common chord in the key of C that uses the 7th is going to be, you guessed it, let's put it over here, what's called the 5/7 chord. Okay, now how did I get to this? Well, you're thinking in C major, that bottom note is G. Here, I'll put this up an octave so you can see it just a little bit more easily. There we go. Okay, does that look familiar? This is the root of the chord, the 3rd, the 5th, the 7th. Why don't you go to the keyboard, try it out? Ah, yes, okay, so I remember that's called the dominant 7th chord. Called 5/7. Okay, I'm just going to put it down an octave just because we have so we have some room to go. Okay, but I wanted you to see it up an octave because it's possibly a little easier to see. Now we're going to go through that same process. This is a root position chord. Okay, root position 5/7. Okay, so now we're going to take this chord. I'm going to copy it. Take that bottom note, move it up an octave. G to G. Oh, all right. This is still a 5/7 chord, but it's in a different inversion. So we have to call it by its name. All right, it's not enough to just say 5/7 because that B is in the bass. So at first we're just going to memorize this. This is called 5/6/5. Okay, I would just say memorize it. We'll talk about why it's called that later. Copy and paste this. I'm going to do it again. Take that bottom note, move it up an octave. Okay, this is also a 5/7 chord, but it's in second inversion. And what is that called? 5/4/3. Okay, and we're going to do the same process again. Copy and paste. Take that bottom note, move it up an octave. Okay, here we're going to call this, a 5/4/2. Okay, and what are these? Well, let's make sure to label them correctly. Now, of course, there's one extra chord because we have one extra note. So there's an extra option, right? For a triad, we only had 3 different chords: root position, first inversion, second inversion. With a 7th chord, you're going to have one more option, and that makes sense, right? Because there's one more note. So we're going to call this the 3rd inversion. Okay, you might try this out on the keyboard again. Root position, first inversion, second inversion, 3rd inversion. Okay. And again, at first I would just write this out for yourself and memorize it, because you're going to see these chords over and over and over again. If I say, oh, this is just a 5-4-3 chord, you need to know what I'm talking about. That's the 2nd inversion triad. I'm sorry, 2nd inversion, 7th chord. Now, if you're wondering, let's say you're already at that point, you already know about inversions, but you're wondering why, wait a second, what's with these numbers? Well, this is the same idea as the triad, where you're measuring the distance between the bottom note and the top note. So of course, root, 3rd, 5th, 7th, this is why we call it the 5-7 chord, because of that chordal 7th. 5-6-5, we have, this is not the root, but it's the bass note. This is the 3rd, the 5th, and the 6th. All right, this is why we call it 6-5, because there's a 6 and a 5. That's an identification. All right, this is the, not the root, but it's the bottom note, the bass note. So this is the 3rd above it, the 4th, and the 6th. Here's the identifying interval. That's why we call it the 5-4-3. And lastly, again, same idea. This is not the root, but it's the bass note. You measure the distance between the bass note and here. That's a 2nd, that's a 4th, that's a 6th. All right, and here is the identifying, the thing that makes it easily identifiable, the 4-2. Again, some textbooks will say, okay, this is the 5-7-5-3. Okay, that's a lot of numbers. This is the 5-6-5-3. Okay, again, it's a lot of numbers to memorize. This is sort of like the shorthand. It's like learning the name Bill instead of William, right? Still the same name. Maybe you have a nickname, or maybe you call one of your friends by their nickname. It's still their name. It's just a shortened version of it. I think it's an easier way to remember the chord, and it's more typical. Okay, I will share these materials with you. Again, I want you to review your scale method. If you never learned it, take a good look at it. Compare your major versus your minor, see if you can identify some intervals. And again, if this is a bit rusty for you, I would write out all this information, put it in some form where you can study it. Okay. All right, and there you have it. There was the world's fastest review. We're going to look today at species 1, so we'll start talking about some of these intervals already. All right, I look forward to seeing you all soon. Take care.